really great to be here today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all. And like I said, I'm a toxicologist, and I'm motivated by the fact that I think we have an ethical responsibility to ensure our children can reach and maintain their full potential. And you folks are right on the front lines of doing that, making sure our children learn. But my interest has been chemical exposure and ensuring that our children's developing nervous system is not affected by a vast range of chemicals in our environment now. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about toxicology, a little bit about that. But first, a little bit how I got here. My research background is in lead and mercury. I did a lot of work on looking at very low levels of exposure to lead and mercury and how they affect the developing nervous system. A little bit I was fascinated by your work on television and looking at stimulation like that. And I then left, much of that work was done in Canada. I left Canada and came to the United States, and at the University of Washington was a faculty member there, and we did continue to work on mercury. But one thing I learned about being in the academic environment, we spent a lot of time learning more and more about less and less. We focus right down. And I got frustrated with that because I was writing grants to learn more about lead and mercury, and I said, we know enough about lead and mercury to make good policy decisions. Why aren't we getting lead out of paint? Why aren't we reducing kids' exposure to lead when we have tremendous amounts of information about the health effects of lead? Same with mercury. So I left university and got involved in the biotech world, was president of a company called BioSupport and one of the owners, and we did contract work for the pharmaceutical and biotech industry. And from there I learned that the pharmaceutical and biotech industry likes disease. Why do they like disease? They make money from treating disease. They're not much on prevention. And my real interest was in prevention, and I love the last speaker talking about preventing. We want to prevent crime. We want to find out what the root causes are. So my interest was in that. I left that after our company was sold. I ran the other company for a couple of years. Then the new owner and I got into some disagreements about who was running the company. I was sure I was. He wasn't quite so sure about that. So I left that, and that's when I wrote the book, Small Dose of Toxicology, and tried to make information more accessible. And then I went on to develop Toxipedia. So toxipedia.org, you can find a lot more information about some of the subjects I'm going to talk about today. And one thing that people ask me is, well, I'm going to give all this information about chemicals and their health effects. What do you do about that? And so a couple simple things you can do is wash hands. Always wash hands. Take off shoes and walk. And of course, have a good nutrition, good diet, good feeding. And I think we're going to find some more about that in the speaker right after me. So I thought I'd talk a little about the chemicals we're exposed to. And while I'm talking, think about the seats you're sitting in. What are those things made out of? Do you have any idea what's in them? So probably not. So we have about 80,000 chemicals that are in commerce. About 3,000 of those are produced in 1 million pounds per year. And about 75% of those chemicals we know very little about. And to contrast that to the pharmaceutical industry, where the FDA requires the pharmaceutical and biotech industry to produce reams of data on the efficacy and safety of their chemicals that we're exposed to in our drugs. We do not have a similar situation that the EPA requires us to look into the industrial chemicals that we're exposed to. That's because TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act, is broken, and I'll come back to that at the end, that we need better chemical policy reform. But I want to talk a little bit about toxicology, a little very quick toxicology 101 here. How many people are caffeine consumers? Oh, wow. Very typical. Great drug, right? So we consume caffeine. How many consume too much caffeine and felt that effect of caffeine? Good neurotoxicologists, all of you. You felt the neurotoxic effects of caffeine. And that's really important because caffeine we feel the effects of. We don't feel the effects of lead, PCBs, brominated flame retardants, many other chemicals that affect our nervous system. How many people have stopped drinking caffeine and gotten a headache? Oh, wow, very honest group here. Drug addicts, you're all drug addicts, by the way. There's a classic sign, you're consuming a drug to avoid the adverse effects. So caffeine's a very powerful drug. What's the half-life of caffeine? How long does it take to metabolize? Caffeine, the half-life is a very important property of all compounds. So you consume your first cup of coffee, how much before you go on to that second one? You drive your blood caffeine levels, say up to 10, they drop down to half. You need some more caffeine. How much time is that? 4 hours, very good. That's about right, about 4 hours, 4 to 5 hours. A lot of individual variability that we have to go back. So think of this drug, this amazing drug, because it has a very short half-life. You can't drink too much at any one time. You get a headache when you stop drinking it. Starbucks makes a fortune off of this. These are the properties of a compound that are ideal for making money from. And the only other better one is really nicotine, which is far more addictive. and got a lot of other problems with nicotine cigarettes. It's nice to see the FDA finally corralling cigarette companies and putting good advertisements on the package, by the way. That was a long time in coming. But so that's caffeine. A couple other interesting things about caffeine. Infants up to about 6 months of age do not metabolize caffeine. So the caffeine they consume has to just be excreted in your urine. And your urine will have about the same concentration of caffeine as your blood. So if you're breastfeeding an infant, that your breast milk will have about the same concentration of caffeine. So you want to consume your caffeine after breastfeeding, not before breastfeeding. So that's really important. During pregnancy, the second and third trimester of pregnancy, caffeine metabolism slows down and your caffeine half-life increases. So you've got a lot of changes that go on, and caffeine's a good example of why it's important to be thinking about the consequences of consumption and sort of state of life, and why infants are not little adults. They're just like with that little infant that doesn't metabolize caffeine, other drugs are the same way. So you got to be thinking about that. And I just want to spend a moment on lead, another good example of why children are not little adults. Lead exposure is really detrimental to learning and development. There's really no safe level of lead exposure. Europe banned lead-based paint in the 20s. When did they do it in the United States? 78. So a huge difference. If we banned lead-based paint in the 20s, we would not have all the problems we have now. So it's really a tragic mistake. Putting lead in gasoline was probably one of the greatest public health disasters ever, one of the worst decisions made. And it's interesting, lead exposure, there's lots of data showing the health effects of lead. And one of the reasons lead is detrimental to kids is not only developing nervous system, we saw some great slides on that, showing how the nervous system develops throughout growth there, how the brain grows. So one of the problems with lead is that it substitutes for calcium. So kids absorb about 50% of the lead they ingest. Adults only absorb about 10%. And that's because the kid's growing, they need that calcium, so they absorb more lead. So the kid that has a poor nutrition, a poor diet, and is exposed to lead, they end up absorbing more lead, greater harm to the developing nervous system. So again, that's another reason that kids are more vulnerable to exposure to a chemical. And it's really interesting, there's some data showing that in New York City, if you lag the lead exposure when they got lead out of gasoline, it fits in with the crime rate. So homicides dropped, and they dropped perfectly with about 20-year lag in lead. So the more lead exposure you have, the more problems you have in school, the more likely you are to commit violent crimes. There's some really interesting data out of New York City. So back to those seats you're sitting on. You ever think of brominated flame retardants? How many heard of brominated flame retardants? You know, Washington State's a really great example. They did a lot of work trying to get brominated flame retardants out of a lot of products. My guess is that those seats probably have a fair amount of brominated flame retardant. They're also probably PVC plastics, chlorinated compound. They might even be reused PVCs, and they use lead as a stabilizer. So another example of how we end up with chemicals in our environment. How about BPA? Bisphenol A, another great example of a chemical. It was diacylstilbestrol. It was developed about the same time as BPA was discovered. Diacylstilbestrol is an endocrine disruptor, and it really is a harmful chemical. It causes next generation cervical cancers. But BPA is the same thing. It's an endocrine disruptor, and they did a lot of work in the legislature in Washington State, should be really proud of this, that they banned BPA in baby bottles, along with Maine. So Washington State's really been a leader in trying to curb chemical exposure, particularly for kids, and trying to make sure their brains are developing. How about pesticides? Pesticides are a real good one, too. We're exposed to a lot of pesticides. Some good work out of the University of Washington showing that you change your diet to move toward more organic foods, you decrease the amount of pesticide excreted in your urine. So that's really important, moving toward more organic food and trying to corral the chemicals we're exposed to. Any other chemicals that people want to talk about? You know, a hot chemical? You know, I could go on and on with all the list of chemicals. Mercury, I just want to touch on mercury for a minute because it really is about connecting the dots. You know, mercury comes out of coal-fired utility plants produce mercury. Mercury ends up in our fish, turns from inorganic to organic mercury. So we've really contaminated a really important source of our food supply with mercury. And that's really important because we know how to stop mercury coming out of coal-fired utility plants. We know what to do about that. And why don't we do that? Why isn't that happening? It's money. Because the coal-fired utility plants, the owners, want to generate electricity. They don't make any money putting pollution control devices on their utility plants. And this is TransAlta. Washington State has one coal-fired utility plant, TransAlta plant down in Centralia. And that plant is going to be closed in 2025. And they put out more than 300 pounds of mercury every year into the environment. So you got to think about, what in our society, from a policy perspective, we know this information. And that's one thing I've tried to do with Toxopedia, is try to make information accessible. My view is we have tremendous amounts of knowledge out there. What we don't do a good job is making it accessible. How do we help people both individually make better decisions and collectively make better decisions? That, I think, is a huge challenge. And I think it's a challenge our academic and our business community really needs to take up, because we spend a lot of time learning more and more about less and less. I mean, I was in that game for years. But we don't spend a lot of resources on trying to make information accessible. Just like the previous speaker saying, how do I know? How do I find out about this stuff? Why isn't this information somehow more accessible? How do we make information more accessible? So I think I just keep thinking about that. And I want to also just touch a little bit on risk assessment and the fact that we're exposed to multiple chemicals. Nobody here is exposed to just one chemical. When you go to the bathroom, you're excreting a little BPA in your urine. You're excreting a whole bunch of other chemicals in your urine that you have no idea. And I don't think anybody in this room gave their consent to be exposed to BPA, did you? No, you didn't. So why is that? Why, we would think that the EPA or the FDA was protecting us from this, and they're really not. The EPA, the BPA issue is hugely controversial. But in general, we don't have a good regulatory policy to corral the chemicals we're exposed to and know more about them and have a precautionary approach. And I want to mention the precautionary principle is an approach to really do no harm. And I hope people remember that we need to move toward a more precautionary approach. The European Union has done that with a REACH program where they're trying to corral industrial chemicals more. We have a very precautionary approach with the FDA. So the FDA does take a precautionary approach and they demand data for efficacy and safety. We don't take that precautionary approach with industrial chemicals because, well, industry doesn't want to do that. They don't want to corral the chemicals they use. And we don't even have rules. We don't have a right to know about what's in our products. What's in cosmetics, what's in the chairs we're sitting on, what's in some of our clothes. There's no right to know. We need to have a better policy about right to know what chemicals we're being exposed to, what chemicals in the products we consume. Are there phthalates in your nail polish? Are there phthalates in your face creams? Is there mercury in some of those face creams? There's just been some interesting stuff coming out with mercury in some of these products again. It just astonishes me. Lead in toys. Washington State, again, was one of the leaders in banning lead in toys. That rule, they banned lead, cadmium, and phthalates. That rule went to the federal level because some of the industry didn't like it. They actually rolled back the requirements for that, and they preempted the Washington State law. Very interesting maneuver, and very frustrating to someone that's worked on this issue. But that's the kind of thing that we're working on, is trying to have good policy. Same with coal-fired utility plants, trying to require them, and the EPA is supposedly coming out with rules and regulation about that. They've just been delayed again. So these are kinds of things that we need to get more involved with, and have a more precautionary approach. Touch on ethics is at Aldo Leopold. How many people, Aldo Leopold? Everybody, Aldo Leopold's a great guy, really one of the first bioethicists, and he really did promote that we have an ethical responsibility, and rules and regulations aren't that bad, that we have a responsibility to have some regulation, and that helps make us live longer. And Garrett Hardin, anybody familiar with Garrett Hardin at all? So he did a little thought experiment where he had a pasture, and around the pasture were several families, and each family had a couple cows around this pasture. Pasture was doing very well, but then somebody's had a couple children. They needed some more milk. They had a couple more cows. Somebody realized they could sell milk down the road, got some more cows. The Joneses wanted more cows than anybody else. Soon the pasture was overwhelmed with cows. What happened to the pasture? It collapsed. You bring in pesticides, you bring in fertilizer, it still doesn't really solve the problem. So the issue is, it's management. You have to manage the problem. You have to manage the solution. And Garrett Hardin's point in this paper, this was done in the 60s, says it's not so much technology we need to manage the technology. Washington State has an abundance of salmon, or it used to, and we now know how to fish, and we really are in charge of all the species. We can outfish the salmon, outfish the whales, we can destroy all those. How do we manage the technology we have? In many, many cases, whether it's nuclear weapons, whether it's lead, whether it's mercury coming out of effluent, we know how to manage the problem, or we know how to do it, we just don't do it. We need to manage the problem. We need more policy and more regulation. I just came back from China, and one of the nicest things coming back from China was in Beijing and Xi'an, was coming back to Northwest clean air. And it was wonderful. You couldn't go down the runways in Xi'an or Beijing and see the plane take off. You literally flew into a bank of haze and smog. So I would suggest to some people who want to roll back some of these air quality regulations, take them and their families over to Beijing and spend a month and really get some idea of the consequences. And we are very fortunate in this country to have good, strong regulation in those areas. Just to conclude, one important thing is take it back. You know, we have, and this is really children around the world. I'm very concerned about children around the world and electronic waste, e-waste for our computers, our laptops. Nobody in this room paid any money to get those laptops and computers, cell phones recycled. Does the manufacturer have to take them back? No. Where do they go? Washington State passed an electronic take-back rule where they're trying to get the manufacturers to be responsibly recycle these products. But a lot of them end up in China, India, Bangladesh, where they're dismantled, and it's often kids that are doing this. And I have a great slide, but I didn't use these slides, where kids are dismantling these products. You know those kids that are doing that are exposed to lead. There's been a number of incidents in China, villages that are dismantling centers. All the kids have blood leads above 20. So it's really tragic to see that happening. So I take it back. We need more consumer take it back. So I just want to mention the website, Toxopedia again, and we have a number of other websites spun off of that. It's a wiki-based site. We're always looking for contributors to it. And we have an integrated pest management site, IPMopedia. We have one on nuclear issues. Nuclear issues are very important in Washington State. And just to mention, I just wrote a little blog about that. And one of the most important things we can do, we need to corral nuclear weapons for the sake of our children, for future generations. You know, just a plug for that, 20 miles from where we sit is Bangor Submarine Base, has the largest concentration of nuclear weapons in the world. So I'm throwing out a lot of dots, and the challenge is, how do you connect all those together? That's the challenge. And I think that's our future generations really do have to connect those dots. And I think I really challenge you all to get involved at the policy level, to write your legislative folks, to deal with those people, to say we want change, we want to protect the children's health, we want a sustainable environment, healthy environment, and we have an ethical responsibility to ensure our children can reach and maintain their full potential. Thank you very much.